Chapter 6: The Contradictory Foundation of Law and the State. The law form, the money form, and the generalization of commodity production. Marx warned that in his economic writings, he tended to deal with the, quote, state law morality only insofar as political economy itself professes to deal with these subjects. And Engels, in turn, commented that he and Marx, quote, neglected the formal side of political, juridical, and other ideological notions, the way in which these notions come about, for the sake of their inner content, end quote. This is not entirely true, as we have seen. Marx and Engels did have many things to say about juridic forms. However, they never traced the logic and history of the development of law and the state in anything like the detail in which they traced the development of money and capital. The connection between private property and value, law and money, and finally state and capital provide a crucial starting point for analysis of juridic forms. Just as value, money, and capital are not things but economic expressions of definite productive relations, so too private property, law, and the state are not impersonal abstract entities but juridic expressions of the same relations. Just as Marx sought to unravel the contradictory character of money and capital, so too subsequent Marxists needed to unravel the contradictory character of law and the state. This parallel was noted in a fine comparison between state and money found in Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed. One second. This parallel was noted in a fine comparison between state and money found in Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed and approvingly cited by Rozdolsky in The Making of Marx's Capital. Quote, "These two problems, state and money, have a number of traits in common, for they both reduce themselves in the last analysis to the problem. Productivity of labor. State compulsion, like money compulsion, is an inheritance from class society, which is incapable of defining the relations of man to man except in the form of fetishes, churchly or secular, after appointing to defend them the most alarming of all fetishes, the state, with a great knife between its teeth. In a communist society, the state and money will disappear. Their gradual dying away ought consequently to begin under socialism. We shall be able to speak of the actual triumph of socialism only at the historic moment when the state turns into a semi-state and money begins to lose its magic power. This will mean that socialism, having freed itself from capitalist fetishes, is beginning to create a more lucid, free, and worthy relation among men. Such characteristically anarchist demands as the, quote, abolition of money, quote, abolition of wages, or, quote, liquidation of the state and family possess interest merely as models of mechanical thinking. Money cannot be arbitrarily, quote, abolished, nor can the state and the family be liquidated. They have to exhaust their historic mission, evaporate, and fall away, end quote. What I have to offer here, that was Trotsky. Whatever I have to offer here are some tentative suggestions as to how a Marxist critique of the juridic forms of law and state might be developed on the basis of Marx's critique of the economic forms of money and capital. Marx analyzed in depth the economic expression of the rule of people by abstractions, far from exchange coordinating the needs of one producer directly with those of another. Through the direct exchange of use values, their needs are related only through the equation of their products as, quote, values, and thus through the mediation of money. The fact of this mediation introduces into the classical parable of symmetrical and harmonious exchange, quote, antithesis and contradiction, end quote. Quote, the simple fact that the commodity exists doubly. The commodity is one aspect as a specific product whose natural form of existence ideally contains its exchange value, and in the other aspect as manifest exchange value, money, in which all connection with the natural form of the product is stripped away. This double differentiated existence must develop into a difference. This contradiction between the commodity's particular natural qualities and the commodity's general social qualities contains from the beginning the possibility that these two separated forms in which the commodity exists are not convertible into one another. As soon as money has become an external thing alongside the commodity, the exchangeability of the commodity becomes bound up with external conditions which may or may not be present. End quote. Money, the embodiment of exchange value in its independent form, is the real abstraction which gains mastery over the people who create it. What Marx only touched upon was the juridic expression of this abstraction. The abstraction of labor is manifest in the form of the value of commodities, in which all trace of the material substance of products disappears, and in which they appear simply as a materialization of a certain amount of abstract labor time. It also manifests itself in the form of the ownership of private property, in which all traces of the material substance of producers disappears, and in which they appear simply as free and equal juridic subjects regardless of their real needs or what they actually own. Like their products, commodity producers also appear in a double form, their natural form and their juridic form. To paraphrase Marx, not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodity producers as owners of private property in contrast to their coarsely sensuous existence as physical human beings. We may twist and turn individuals as we wish, it remains impossible to grasp human beings as owners of property as juridic subjects. Commodity producers are abstracted in this way only because they work independently of each other in private. Quote, since the producers do not come into social contact until the producers exchange the products of their labor, the specific social characteristics of their private labor appears only within this exchange of their products. To the producers, therefore, the social relations between their labors appear as what they are, i.e., they do not appear as direct social relations between persons in their work, but rather as material relations between persons and social relations between things. End quote. The economic expression of this organization of labor, i.e., social relations between things, has been analyzed by Marx at length. Its juridic expression, quote, material relations between persons, end quote, persons being treated solely as owners of private property from this viewpoint only, to the exclusion of all other qualities, needs, desires, etc., has received comparatively little attention. The simple fact that the commodity producers exist doubly as specific individuals with specific needs and as abstracted owners of rights must develop into, quote, antithesis and contradiction, end quote. This double existence contains, from the beginning, the possibility that individuals will not be able to translate their needs into rights and their rights back into the fulfillment of their needs. As soon as rights become an external thing alongside the commodity producer, the exchangeability of the property of producers into rights to the property of others, a condition of their survival, becomes bound up with external conditions which may or may not be present. The mediation of relations between people in the form of a contract between free and equal subjects is a strange and mysterious phenomenon, as, quote, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties, end quote, as the parallel and simultaneous mediation of relations between two commodities by money. Just as value expresses itself independently, first in the form of money, then in the form of capital, so too ownership of private property expresses itself independently, first in the form of law and then in the form of the state. With the generalization of commodity exchange, rights of ownership assume the independent form of a, quote, third party, end quote, who represents in his or her person rights of ownership in general. Just as a specific commodity, e.g. gold, takes on the social form of money, so too a specific individual or group of individuals takes on the social form of law. In bourgeois countries which emerged out of feudalism, this function was played in part, for example, by feudal lords who discovered in their juridic role a lucrative supplement to their private revenues. But just as there is nothing in the nature of gold itself that makes it money, so too there was nothing in the nature of feudal lords to make them, quote, the law, end quote. While Marx analyzed in detail why the development of commodity production necessarily generates money as the objective and independent form taken by exchange value, he only hinted at the parallel process by which it generates law as the objective and independent form taken by private property. I shall tentatively follow his clues. We have seen that as owners of private property, individuals differ from themselves as natural, sensuous human beings. In simple exchanges, rights of ownership were immediately identified with producers. It was their immediate quality from which they were soon to split, so that on one side there arose individual producers, and on the other side, rights. Law presents rights of ownership to individuals as something different from themselves. In the form of law, producers relate to their rights as something outside themselves. It arises from the essence of private property that a specific person or group will obtain the privilege of representing the rights of all producers. The individuals who don the mantle of law serve as the personification of abstract right, of rights abstracted from particular commodity producers. They acquire this property not by virtue of their natural capacities, nor by virtue of their being themselves commodity producers with their own private interests like everyone else, but by their role in the system of exchange as a kind of, quote, universal equivalent, end quote, in whom all owners of private property seek to represent their rights. Specific individuals are socially selected because of their natural capacities, just as gold was selected as the money commodity because of its natural qualities of divisibility, durability, etc., to serve as the universal equivalent of private rights. But just as the natural qualities of gold do not make gold money, so too the natural capacities of these people do not make them the personification of right. Henceforth, commodity producers can bring themselves into relation with one another as owners of private property indirectly only by bringing themselves into an opposing relation with some other individuals who serve as the universal equivalent of their rights. The natural form of these persons thereby becomes the socially recognized equivalent form. Their word, as it is said, is law. They are the law. The generalization of exchange develops the opposition between the natural individual and the owner of private property, which is latent in the nature of the commodity producer, and generates the drive towards an independent form of right, which, quote, finds neither rest nor peace, end quote, until an independent form has been achieved by the differentiation of commodity producers into owners of private property and the law. Law, then, is a social power, the result of the development of social relations of commodity production. The discovery that law is a product of human activity was made in the first quarter of the 1600s by Hobbes, but this was merely a first step in discovering how, why, and by what means human activity becomes law. Quote, a Negro is a Negro and only becomes a slave in certain relations, end quote. Marx used this analogy to show that gold is a mineral that becomes commodity only in certain relations, and money with the development of these relations. So too, a particular individual becomes an owner of private property only under certain relations, and the embodiment of law with the development of these relations. Torn from these relations, an individual is no more law than gold in itself is money. Looked at from the other side, just as the abstraction of money is a social form taken by a particular commodity, so the abstraction of law is a social form taken by a particular commodity producer or set of commodity producers. All authority is a relation between people. All authority is a relation between people. It is a mystification to contrast a government of laws to a government of people, since a government of laws is but the fetishized form taken by the government of people under certain definite circumstances. Further, the person or persons who embody legal authority are themselves private property owners, albeit one socially selected to perform a particular function in commodity production. Thus it is also a mystification to contrast the rule of law with the rule of private interests. Since the rule of law is the fetishized form taken by the rule of private interest under determinate social relations, the law is itself, as Marx commented, a private interest. The contradictory functions of law. One second. Let me make sure this thing's still recording. Having some trouble earlier today. Alright, we're in business. The contradictory functions of law. Marx differentiated the emergence of the form of money from the function which it is called upon to perform once established. In this manner, rather than assuming the functionality of money, that is, that money performs its function rationally and successfully, he explored the necessarily contradictory ways in which money performs its multiple functions and the tensions between its forms and functions. So too he laid the basis for, but did not himself offer, an analogous exploration of the contradictory functions of law. Drawing on Marx's analysis of the functions of money, I offer here some tentative suggestions concerning the functions of law. The first function of law is to serve as a, quote, a measure of right, end quote. This is my terminology. Commodity producers, as it were, hang a ticket on their products, declaring their right to own and exchange them. Since the juridic form of commodities is quite distinct from their real bodily form, quote, the guardian of the commodities must lend them his tongue, end quote, to communicate to the outside world that they are his or hers. Since the expression of their rights in law is a purely ideal act involving no actual transaction, we may use purely imaginary law to perform this operation. The law does not have to be present in any palpable shape. All commodity producers know that they are nowhere near turning the products of their labor into rights to the property of others, nowhere near realizing their claims to property simply by this statement of ownership. But although the law, which performs the function of measure of right, is imaginary, the form in which individuals express their property rights depends on the substance of the legal system. For example, in a primitive legal system where one individual simply is the law, producers will assert their rights by appealing to the imaginary approval of this individual, like Adam Smith's, quote, impartial observer, end quote. In a developed legal system where law is a codified product of many individuals and many generations, the form in which individuals must assert their property rights is by reference to this or that statutory clause or common law decision. In other words, law assumes a second function which depends entirely on its content, that of the, quote, normative standard, end quote. The forms in which property owners express their claims depend on the substance of law and will vary from one legal system to the next. As measure of right and as normative standard, the law performs quite different functions. It is the measure of right as the social incarnation of free and equal human labor. It is a normative standard as a self-sufficient body of rules. As a measure of right, the law refers outside itself to convert the labor of commodity producers into legal entitlements. As a normative standard, it refers internally to its own codification, derivation, and systematization of norms. The latter function has given rise to the wildest theories like those of, quote, legal formalism, end quote, according to which the study of law must be limited to that of the law's own formal arrangements, regardless of the law's relation to the external world. Confusion arises since any legal term, say criminal damage, refers both to the rights of property owners and to a conventional body of legal norms. By giving privilege to one or other function of law, a very one-sided view of that law, quote, essentially, of what law, quote, essentially, end quote, is, will emerge. Either a, quote, formalism exemplified by Hans Kelsen, which abstracts law altogether from its social content, or a, quote, abstract materialism, end quote, which sees law as no more than an ideological expression of social relations. C. Reisner. The dual functions of law appear sharply in those cases where substantive social issues cohabit with purely formal legal issues. For example, during the debates on women's suffrage, supporters of votes for women asserted the right of women to vote on the basis of the Reform Act of 1867, which established the right to vote of every, quote, man householder. The argument shifted from the rights of women to the meaning of the legal category of, quote, man, end quote. Whether, like the Latin homo, it meant human being, male and female alike, or whether it was gender specific. The democratic argument for women's rights was lost. Quote, man, end quote, was legally defined in its narrow masculine sense. The case reveals, however, that whether women had a right to vote was a question which hung, on the one side, on the recognition of women's labor as equal human labor, carrying with it the same juridic entitlements as men's labor. On the other side, it was a question of law which could be determined only by reference to the particular norms of a particular legal order. The assertion of a right of ownership is similarly a tricky business, since the owner must look over one shoulder to his or her place in the social relations of production, and at the same time over the other shoulder to a conventional legal system. The normative form of law is compatible with, indeed it will necessarily engender, an incongruity between rights of private property and normative standards, between, quote, natural rights, end quote, and, quote, positive law, end quote. This possibility is inherent in the normative form itself. Far from being a defect, it makes the normative form an adequate one for a mode of production in which the regulation of labor by society asserts itself only indirectly after the event as the, quote, precarious result of constant irregularities, end quote. It is only after the event, in the course of exchange, that private producers have their rights to own the products of their labor socially validated in the form of law. It is only after the event, in the course of exchange, that private producers have their rights to own the products of their labor socially validated in the form of law. If private property rights in one area of production are not reflected in the normative standards of law, then producers will move out of that area of production into another area of production. If, conversely, the normative standard of law upholds rights in one area of production which are not reflected in private property, then producers will move into that area. The normative form of law is not only compatible with an incongruity between rights of private property, as determined by a definite form of labor, and normative standards. It may cease altogether to express private property rights, despite the fact that law is nothing but the objectification of these rights. Things which in and of themselves are not private property, things in which no abstract labor is embodied, like conscience, honor, reputation, etc., can acquire the form of private property through the law. One can be sued or punished for violating rights to them, just as one can alienate them in order to acquire rights to another commodity. A third function of law is that of, quote, mediation, or, quote, medium of association, end quote, between commodity producers. Commodity producers can relate to one another only as owners of private property whose mutual bond takes the legal form of a contract. This, of course, is a particular form of human association, entirely different either from one based on personal dependence, a master-servant relation, or from one based on mutual cooperation, concern for each other's needs, etc. The specific character of law as a mediation between individuals is that individuals relate to each other exclusively in terms of the property they own and the rights which they thereby possess, and are indifferent to all other aspects of people. As far as legal relation is concerned, it matters only that the rights of each party are secured, regardless of all other consequences for the individuals in question. Whether one individual is impoverished and another enriched. The specific character of law as a mediation between individuals is that individuals relate to each other exclusively in terms of the property they own and the rights which they possess, and are indifferent to all other aspects of people. As far as a legal relation is concerned, it matters only that the rights of each party are secured, regardless of all other consequences for the individuals in question. Whether one individual is impoverished and another enriched by relations based on their rights of private property is a question outside the ambit of legal relations themselves. The law serves as a means of inhibition over what one individual may do to another individual. It states that they must treat each other as free and equal subjects, but only from one point of view, that of property ownership. In legal relations, individuals relate to each other solely as means to their private ends. This does not mean that they can act towards others in any way they like, but it does mean that their concern for others is limited to concern for the rights of others as property owners, while everything else about the needs, capacities, and desires of others becomes a matter of complete indifference. Subjects of a legal relation relate to each other as autonomous entities, mutually competitive, self-involved, and for whom, in Hobbes' image, the law provides the only form in which they take into consideration the interest of others. The last function of law that I shall consider is that of being a, quote, means of regulating relations, end quote, between people. As such, the law must have a real material existence, a palpable bodily form. The law must possess the physical means of adjudicating in disputes between contending parties, of apprehending individuals, and of enforcing its decisions. In more developed legal systems, a division of labor grows up between the various functions of apprehension, the police, of adjudication, the courts, and of punishment, the penal system. Law is a specific means of regulating disputes with its own peculiar characteristics. This is the function of law in which its objectivity and independence stand out most firmly. The law not only arbitrates between conflicting private interests, but also becomes itself a particular interest which enters into disputes with other particular interests, and then arbitrates between itself and those other interests. Thus the law may come into conflict with certain kinds of activities which are objected to in the main by the law itself, but not by the vast majority of individuals in the community. Sorry. This separation of law as an autonomous individuals in the community, this seems to have been the case, for example, in the 1700s laws against smuggling and poaching. This separation of law as an autonomous force alongside other private interests is inherent in this function of law. The police, to take a modern instance, as a corporate body representative of the law, became a powerful private interest in their own right. From its servile role in which the law appeared as a mere medium of association, a mere mediation between property owners, it suddenly changes into the Lord and God of the world of property owners. With its bodily independence, law now represents not simply the rights of one commodity producer against another commodity. With its bodily independence, law now represents not simply the rights of one commodity owner against another commodity owner, but rather the rights of one particular commodity owner, the law itself, against all others. Although the law possesses a substance of its own, the law appears at the same time as the embodiment of the universal rights of all property owners. The law is a general power, as opposed to its diffusion and fragmentation in a world of private property owners. With the development of law, the idea of power in general becomes real. The substance of law is power itself. Extracted from its particular mode of existence, not power through ownership of this or that property, but power as such, irrespective of what or whom it is power over. In the form of law, power becomes in itself an object of greed and ambition. There are, however, limits to the independence of law, for law derives from transactions between private property owners and disappears with their termination. Its autonomous existence is transitory. When law becomes fully independent of circulation between property owners, then it is no longer merely law, but takes on the new social form of the state, as we shall see. In its independence from exchange, law latently contains its potential as the state, but is not to be identified with the state. From the perspective of law, the individual's essence is that of being a property owner. From the perspective of law, the individual's essence is that of being a property owner, while the real needs, desires, capacities, etc. of the individual appear as mere abstractions, the phenomenal form in which the individual's essence is manifested. From this perspective, rationality consists in acting as the ideal property owner, respect for the rights of others, indifference to others except in regard to their rights, pursuit of self-interest within the bounds of the law, observance of the law. It is this perspective which Hegel and the other representatives of classical jurisprudence reflected and idealized. This is the juridic illusion under which one's formal existence appears as one's real existence, while one's real existence appears as a formality. In its function as regulator of social relations, the law needs to exercise real force over individuals, but force appears in a wholly mystified shape. Relations of domination and subordination between people appear in the fetishized form of a relation between reason and unreason. The individuals who function as law serve as mirrors to other individuals of their own rational human existence. In the activities of those who represent the law, others discover the reflection of their, quote, true selves. It appears that law is on the side of reason, that reason is on the side of law, and that subordination to the law is subordinate to one's own rational being. This is the basis on which an ideal synthesis of coercion and consent is founded. The law coerces those who oppose it and designates them criminals, but it does so in the name of the criminals themselves. Since criminals appear as violators of a law which embodies the universal rights of all, including themselves, power appears accordingly not as an alien force inflicted by another, but as self-punishment, the force of reason over unreason, humanity over inhumanity, conscience over guilt. The real punisher appears as no more than a mirror of, and means of enforcing, the criminal's own rational will and interests. There seems to be no opposition between the criminal and the law, since the law is the personification of the criminal's own sense of right. Power no longer appears as what it is, the subjection of one individual to another, but rather as the realization of reason and humanity. Criminals, as it is said, are punished for their own good and for the good of society as a whole, whether or not those criminals are reformed as individuals, and whether or not the punishment succeeds in protecting society. In law, power is exercised in the name of the community, but simultaneously the law becomes the community, while the real community appears as an abstraction. In this context, violation of the law can appear only as guilt, that is, as a violation of one's own true self. The language of law is indifferent to everything about people and their acts except the category of, quote, guilt and, quote, innocence, quote, liability and, quote, non-liability, into which they are forced to fit. The law presupposes that all, as individuals, possess a will, are free and equal human beings, and this is a great advance over the old order, but it recognizes only our will, freedom, and equality as property owners. So it sees no contradiction in suppressing with the utmost vigor the real will of individuals, in order that their rational will may prevail, in treating people most unfreely so that they may be forced to be free. Law and coercion are by no means counterposed. Rather, that coercion should take the form of law is the expression of the fact that private property rules humankind, that the individual's formal existence as a property owner rules his or her real existence as a sensuous human being. All the contradictions of law emerge most sharply in its function as means of regulation. The law seems to engender community and common humanity, but at the same time, law produces mutual isolation, indifference, and antagonism. The law is predicated on equality, but establishes the sharpest differentiation between the judges and the judged, the police and the policed, the gaolers and the galled, or the gaolers and the galled. The law presupposes universal freedom, but justifies universal coercion precisely in freedom's name. The law posits will and rationality as the universal attributes of humankind, but negates manifestations of will and reason which contravene the dictates of the law. These contradictions lie at the heart of law, between abstract collectivity and mutual antagonism, between abstract equality and the splitting of society into two parts, between abstract freedom and general coercion, between abstract reason and the suppression of reasoning that does not accord with private property. In short, between the juridic form of the individual as property owner and the natural form of the individual as producer, consumer, and social being with real individual needs. Various forms of law may correspond better to social production relations at various stages. One form may remedy evils against which another is powerless, but to paraphrase Marx's discussion of money, as long as they remain forms of law, and as long as law remains an essential relation of production, none of them is capable of overcoming the contradictions inherent in juridic relations. The state form, the capital form, and capitalist relations of production. Just as money is a developed form of value, and capital is a developed form of money, so too law is a developed form of juridic right, and the state is a developed form of law. This relation between law and the state has given rise to two opposing kinds of misconception. On the one hand, it may appear that all juridic categories, including law and state, are so many names for the same relation, and this crude inability to grasp real distinctions is represented as a discovery of the inner nature of juridic relations. It seems that there is only one single juridic relation which takes on different names, or that the differences that do occur are not, quote, fundamental. Thus, some critiques of the, quote, legal form, end quote, treat the turning of law into the state not as a real transformation of the legal form, but merely as its extension or consolidation. They see that the state emerges out of law, but then treat the state merely as a consolidation or quantitative extension of law, rather than as its real transformation. The state appears to embody no principles that are not to be found in the simple legal form itself. The move from law to state should be regarded like the move from money to capital, as a transition from a lower, simpler form of social life to one that is higher and more complex. In the course of this transition, the state acquires properties that go beyond the properties of law as such. Quote, it can be regarded as a higher realization, as it can be said that man is a developed ape, end quote. Just as with the transition from money to capital, money does not disappear, but rather it reappears in a new form, and with new functions as money capital, so too the transition from law to state, the law appears in a new form and with new functions as state law. Law as state law possesses properties which transcend its properties simply as law, just as money capital has properties not possessed by money as such. Confusion arises when properties belonging to law as state law are attributed to law as such, since the form of appearance is identical in each case. With the emergence of the state, law persists as one of the forms taken by the state, but not as its only form. The state also takes the form of a bureaucracy, an army, an assembly, etc., and law, which pre-existed the state and makes up one of the state's presuppositions, now becomes only one of the forms assumed by state power. There is, of course, no inevitability that law will grow into the state, in the same way as money does not always grow into capital. Nonetheless, just as, quote, the concept of value precedes that of capital, but requires for its full development a mode of production founded on capital, end quote, i.e. the generalization of commodity exchange, takes place only with the transformation of commodity into capitalist production, so too the concept of law precedes that of the state, but it requires for the concept of law's full development, the establishment of the state. It comes as no surprise, then, that bourgeois jurists and their socialist critics sometimes consider the state as the creator of laws, without seeing that it is but a development of law, and sometimes portrays it as no more than a sum of laws, without seeing that it expresses a qualitative transformation of law, and not just a quantitative aggregate. The alternative misconception about the relation between law and state is one that divorces the state from law, as if two entirely distinct principles were at stake. It appears that there exists no essential connection between law and state. Or to put the matter the other way around, that whatever connections do exist are purely contingent. It is imagined by some bourgeois and socialist critics that the, quote, rule of law, end quote, is essentially or originally a system of universal freedom and equality, but that it is perverted by the development of the state. To such a view, the correct response should be that the state represents precisely the development of the system of freedom and equality found in law, and takes to a higher level the contradictions already latent within this system. Just as, to pursue Marx's analogy, the distinction between ape and human being, money and capital, do not mean that they are unrelated, so too appreciation of the real distinction between law and state should not lead us to draw a watertight divide between law and state, as if one were not the direct progeny of the other. The state, like capital, is the expression of definite social relations of production. Capital, Marx demonstrated, quote, is not a thing but rather a definite social production relation belonging to a definite historical formation of society, which is manifested in a thing and lends this thing a specific social character, end quote. Thus the definition of capital as, say, accumulated means of production ignores the specific form of capital, namely that accumulated means of production become capital only when they are, quote, monopolized by a certain section of society, and confronting living labor power as products and working conditions rendered independent of this very labor power, end quote. If the specific form of capital is abstracted away and only its material content is emphasized, then nothing is easier than to demonstrate that capital is a necessary condition of all developed human production. The same argument applies equally to the state. If the state is defined as a means of regulating society, it does not follow that all such means are state means. If the state is defined as an agency of social control, it does not follow that all social control is state control. If the state is defined as something which functions for the reproduction of capitalist relations of production, it does not follow that everything which performs this function is the state. The state necessarily comprises a body of armed men, but not every body of armed men constitutes part of a state. The state administers justice and the police, but not all administration of justice and not all policing are state justice and state policing. The form of the state is what marks its specific social character. If exclusive attention is paid to its material content at the expense of its form, then the state will appear as the necessary condition of any form and every complex social order. The first question, then, is to explore the presuppositions of the state form with regard to its affinity and to distinction from the legal form. The state realizes the quality which was only latent in law, that its independent existence outside the process. The state realizes the quality which was only latent in law, that of its independent existence outside the process of circulation. In law as such, we have seen that juridic rights have already acquired an objective form, but only as a transitory expression of circulation. In the state, the independence and objectivity of law are confirmed with the establishment of a state apparatus, which perpetuates and increases itself in the course of circulation. In the simple circulation of commodities, where producers exchange their products for money, and then money for products which will be consumed as use values, the process Marx refers to through the formula commodity, money, commodity. Law exists independently only as a regulator of the process of circulation. It loses this character as soon as the circulation process is completed and the commodity which has exchanged itself for another commodity through the medium of, on the one hand, money, and on the other, a juridic contract between commodity producers, steps out of circulation in order to be consumed or destroyed. Looked at juridically, the process of circulation requires a move from private owner to legally enforceable contract to private owner. In this circuit, the independence of law is transitory while private consumption of use values, the meeting of private needs, or in many cases the failure to meet private needs, is the outcome. The repetition of the process is not presupposed within the conditions of the exchange as such. Simple circulation of this sort does not, as Marx put it, quote, carry within itself the principle of self-renewal. Commodities constantly have to be thrown into it from the outside, like fuel into a fire. Otherwise, it flickers out in indifference. If one property owner forms a contract with another, then the legal moment disappears as soon as the contract is fulfilled, and the parties to it step outside this relation and turn to the direct satisfaction of their respective needs. As soon, however, as law does not be, as soon, however, as law not only becomes independent of property owners themselves, but maintains and develops itself through the process of circulation, then it no longer remains law but becomes the state. The fact that law may, under some historical circumstances, excuse me, as soon, however, as law not only becomes independent of property owners themselves, but maintains and develops itself through the process of circulation, then it no longer remains law but becomes the state. The fact that law may, under some historical circumstances, be the first form taken by the state by no means contradicts this development, but does obscure the real transition that is taking place. The circuit of capital which Marx analyzes is that of money turning itself into commodities, means of production and labor power, which turns itself through a productive process into new commodities and then back again into more money. Marx designated it by the formula money, commodity, new commodity, money plus surplus value. That's not actually how it's written in the book. It's MCCM, but it's a bit different than how it's usually presented as MCM, and it's probably trying to elucidate a particular aspect of that relation. Viewed juridically, both the beginning and the end of this process require the existence of law, for money, unlike objects of direct need, retains its function as money only in the context of a definite legal order, which guarantees the functioning of a particular commodity as money, i.e. legal tender. Self-preservation and self-expansion of law provide the first formal criteria which mark the turning of law into state, that is, the emergence of a state machinery which obtains a real and lasting independence of its own. The emergence of a state machinery which obtains a real and lasting independence of its own. With the extension of simple commodity exchange, the various parties to the exchange necessarily establish a legal authority to regulate the circulation process, as was ideally envisaged in the social contract theories of classical jurisprudence. But the objective existence of this legal authority is precarious, dependent on a voluntary transfer of surplus product from the producers to the legal authority. The precondition for the emergence of a permanent state apparatus, and the state, as Marx said, is nothing without its apparatus, is first the production of a surplus over and above the immediate needs of the parties to the exchange, and second, the development of means whereby part of this surplus is channeled into a state machinery. These conditions for turning law into state are met only with the transformation of commodity into capitalist production, though the real history of the state, like the real history of capital, does not follow in any simple way this formal exposition. With the self-perpetuation of the law as state law, there also develops the differentiation of the state itself. Law becomes now only one of the forms assumed by the state, though historically it often arose as the first form taken by the state. The state constantly changes its particular forms in accord with the new functions it is called upon to perform. It moves perpetually from law to bureaucracy to legislation to armed force to education to welfare to police, etc., and it exists at once in all these forms. It is the relation of the state's particular forms to the whole that determines the significance of each of its particular forms. Thus, the significance of law in the context of a representative legislature is quite different from the significance of law outside this context. The attachment of law to a developed apparatus of policing and punishment alters the properties of law in comparison with a situation in which law is not so attached. The subsuming of law to a state bureaucracy, with, for example, the bureaucratic appointment of a judiciary, gives to law a social character it would not otherwise possess. Just as money capital is not the only form of capital, so too state law is not the only form of state. However, this relation between state and law gives rise to great confusion when properties are attributed to law as such, which are in fact properties of a particular kind of state law. Thus, some bourgeois and socialist writers ascribe to the law as such democratic properties which it possesses only as one form of a democratic state. Conversely, others ascribe to law as such negative properties, e.g., being an instrument of class oppression, which it acquires by virtue of its placement within the capitalist state as a whole. The substantive character of the state. One second. The substantive character of the state lies in its expropriation of power from the mass of the people and its monopolization by a small minority. It is this aspect of the state form which Lenin caught so well in State and Revolution. The state is a special force alienated from society, a public power which arises out of society but places itself above it. As an armed force, the state is not the armed people armed, but the separation of armed force from the people, and its monopolization by the state. As a police, the state is not the self-regulation of society by its own members, but rather the alien regulation of society by a police hierarchy. As law, the state is not merely the administration of justice, but rather the expropriation of the means of administering justice by the state. As economic regulator, the state is not just planner of production and distribution, but represents the loss of these functions for the people themselves. In short, the form of the state presupposes the development of an alien power separated from the mass of the people. For such a power to come into being, a definite historical process was required, which possessed a twofold character. On the one hand, separation of the means of exercising legal authority from feudal lords, princes, private capitals, and other personal potentates of pre-capitalist society, and on the other, the accumulation of the means of exercising legal authority by a special body of people. This general historical process left its mark on the state in quite different ways in different societies. In previous forms of class society, political power was fused with economic exploitation, as Marx frequently emphasized, and class rule tended accordingly to be the direct rule of one class over another class. It was only with the development of capital that class rule began to take the indirect form of state rule. Marx thus dates the beginnings of the state in the declining years of feudalism. And in the emergence of merchant capital. Witness, for example, his comment in the Civil War in France that, quote, centralized state power originated from the Middle Ages, developed in the 19th century, and with the development of class antagonism between capital and labor, assumed more and more the character of a machine of class rule, end quote. With this in mind, Engels' brief comments deriving the state from class antagonism in general, and characterizing the state as the means of suppression owned by the, quote, most powerful economically dominant class, end quote, whichever that class may be, comments which have had enormous influence on 20th century Marxist theory of the state, both, quote, revolutionary, Lenin, and, quote, reformist, Kautsky, did not coincide with Marxist stated views, and more importantly, did not take into account the formal aspects of state power. This, quote, class theory, end quote, of the state laid itself open to criticism, which we find in Coletti and Pashukanis, that while it explained the class content of the state, it did not explain why class rule should assume the particular form of state power. Feudalism, for instance, was manifestly a class society, but the state form was largely undeveloped. Although the state is in general an alien force above society, Although the state is in general an alien force above society, the form, content, and extent of this alienation is, of course, not fixed. The democratic republic is premised on a degree of alienation quite distinct from and far preferable to, say, absolutist monarchy, apartheid, or a fascist dictatorship. Accountability of the police to democratically representative bodies, access of citizens to state secrets, subordination of bureaucracy to parliament and courts, openness of courts to the public, participation of the public in the administration of justice, albeit in the highly limited role of jury service, in which the sole function of ordinary citizens is to decide on the guilt or non-guilt of an individual under certain restrictive conditions, subjection of what goes on inside police stations and prisons to public scrutiny, rights of citizens not to be subjected by the police to arbitrary search, stop, arrest, detention, and interrogation. Rights of citizens to organize themselves independently of the state in free trade unions uninhibited legally from taking collective action, in political movements uninhibited legally from demonstrating political commitments, in self-defense groups against racist attacks or against police harassment, etc., etc. All such matters inhibit the alienation of the state from society. The erosion of such rights and freedoms marks a change for the worse in the relation of state to society. At the same time, the police, the courts, the bureaucracy, etc., remain, from the point of view of society, alien powers over which society may exercise more or less influence, but which belong to that which is opposed to society, the state. In general, it is as absurd to turn an appreciation of the alien character of the state into a reason for abstaining from democratic struggles as it is to abstract democracy from its alien base as state democracy. The opposition between state and labor is the juridic expression of capitalist relations of production, whose economic expression is the opposition between capital and labor. In both cases, living labor constructs forces which stand against it as the alienated form of its own powers. Capital represents the appropriation without equivalent of the products of labor, while the state represents the appropriation without equivalent of the powers of the laborer. Just as the right to the product of one's own labor turns, quote, through its own necessary dialectic, end quote, into the expropriation of the products of one's own labor, at the same time the private right of individuals to dispose of their property as they will turns into the expropriation of this right by the state as the monopolizer or legal authority. The owner of private property, who started life as an autonomous and self-directing atom, becomes the mere bearer of only those rights granted by state laws whose interpretation, application, and enforcement are prerogatives of the state itself. Just as capital presupposes the divorce of labor from all commodities except labor power. Just as capital presupposes the divorce of labor from all commodities except labor power, so the state presupposes the divorce of labor from all rights except ownership of one's own labor power. This exception is not insignificant. The juridic freedom and equality of labor distinguish capitalism from other forms of class society and serve as a necessary counterpoint to the power of capital and the state. The state is the juridic aspect of capital created by labor. It turns into the antithesis of labor. Thus the state, like capital in general, should be seen not as a thing, but as a class relation. The class character of the state lies not merely in who controls the state, nor in what functions the state performs, but in the form of the state itself, just as the class character of capital, in general, lies not in the fact that it is controlled by capitalists, nor in the function it performs, but in capital itself as a social relation. The state is not something alien to capital. It is rather an aspect of capital, a definite form which capital takes in the course of its internal differentiation. The state may thus be transferred from one set of individuals to another, and may be put to new uses, but the state remains the state, the independent juridic form taken by the capital-labor relation, thus an independent form of capital. The relation between the state and other forms of capital is contradictory. The state is at once a guarantee for the production and circulation of surplus value, and itself a drain on surplus value, with its own corporate interest, its own social base, its own needs and pressures. The state derives from private property, but it also becomes an alien form in opposition to private property, since the state assumes unto itself the rights associated with private property. The state becomes the real abstraction of the power of capital, an object of greed and ambition in its own right. Private property and the state are complementary poles, dependent on each other for their mutual survival, but antithetical to each other not merely as competitors for the lion's share of surplus value, but as embodiments of private right and socialized power respectively. The state represents the socialization of power in an alien capitalist form. Consequently, its relation both to capital and to labor is inherently contradictory. Workers need the social power of the state against the private rights of capital, but they do not need the state's alienated form. Capitalists need the state's alienated form as its guarantee against labor, but live in apprehension of the state's social power. If the contradictory character of the relation between state and capital is missed, then all is missed. The state does not transcend the contradictions inherent in capital. Rather, in the state's own particular way, the state necessarily embodies them.